Welcome to the Growing People podcast. I'm John Losey. I'm your host. And today we're going to have a great conversation with Fred Harburg, where he talks about, and we're going to chat about accountability and its importance in helping people grow and being a thought partner and coach with people. Before we dive into our conversation, I wanted to ask a favor from everybody and anybody who's listening. I really love doing these podcasts. I have two channels, the Growing People podcast and Living Life Juicy. And I want to get better at what I'm doing. And I need access to some tools to do that. Well, the YouTube channels require that I have a certain number of subscribers before I get access to some of the tools. So if you could do me a favor and just on this page, right down below the video, there's a little subscribe tab. If you could do that, that would be really helpful. Subscribe. And Fred and I will be having these conversations. You're going to see that there's also some other resources that you can use to show to different people to bring up topics about growing people. The other website the other YouTube channel I have is called Living Life Juicy. Living Life Juicy is my experiment this year around how do I be kind as I try to do great things in my life and my world. Each broadcast, each episode, I share a challenge. I share my successes and failures in living juicy, and I want people to join along in that journey. So please, if you get a chance, subscribe to the Growing People podcast or Living Juicy, and help me learn how to get better at this stuff so that I can provide great materials for you guys. With that, I'd like to welcome Fred Harburg. We're going to have a great conversation today where we're going to look about the ins and outs of accountability and where it falls and how we can intentionally use accountability to help individuals and organizations grow. Fred is a clinical professor at Kellogg School of Management, so he gets a chance to dive in this stuff deep all the time. This is in a series of interviews with Fred where we're exploring all different topics around growing people. So Fred, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. I always enjoy this, John.
Yeah, so fun. So tell me a little bit about where, in the bigger picture, where does accountability fall and why is it so crucial in helping people grow and develop and being thought partners?
You bet. Well, in my work over the decades, working with both senior executives and then also working with large and small organizations, the fact is that when you see either in an executive or in a corporate culture accountability, they always flourish and outperform anyone else. That's true on the individual level, it's true at the team level, it's true at the organizational level. You can think of classic examples of this. Intel is famous for the degree of accountability that exists within the company. When people make a commitment, they carry through on the commitment. More contemporaneously, you find the same true at Intel, at Ray Dalio's Bridgewater, and you'd find the same true at Apple. What Steve Jobs did at Apple and what Ray Dalio did at Bridgewater were create extreme cultures of accountability. And the achievements that they occurred, the superior results that they achieved occur in a couple of books. Ray Dalio has recently written a book called Principles. And in it, he lays out what he calls radical transparency and also the idea of radical accountability. And his culture is unquestioned in terms of its performance. The most successful hedge fund in the history of the world, I think $154 billion under assets under management. He started it in his bedroom about 30 years ago, and he went through some tough times. But in 2009, or 2007 rather, he was really the only person who really called out in a major way the fact that we were ripe at the moment for a crash. And he shorted when no one else was doing so. And I think they earned about $30 billion as a consequence of that. He signaled it to the world. That story is interesting, but the more important story he tells in Principles is about the culture in the company he created. He says, and I agree with this, I don't agree with everything in the book, but I agree with the idea that ultimately what makes the difference in the success of an individual or of a company, in a company case, it's the people and culture. In a person's case, it's the character. And this idea around being accountable is right smack in the center of what we would call the character of a person.
So tell me a little bit about, before we go too far down this route, what is accountability? And how is it different? Because I hear all the time, and in fact, for the past decade, you hear managers and leaders talking about accountability, but it comes across as a very negative thing. Like, I'm gonna catch you doing something wrong, and that's holding people accountable. How is this different, or is it different?
Well, it is absolutely different in the best sense, because even Dalio talks about this radical accountability culture and radical transparency that he created. Bridgewater almost sank the culture at one point because people felt that he was a jerk, in his own words. Fortunately, he was attentive to that and made some significant shifts with people's help. So there's accountability, and then there's accountability. And I would say that authoritarian, brutal, insensitive accountability is a weapon. It's the overuse of strength without compassion. And when people exercise it in that way, the culture can become toxic. You can get a fear-based culture with brutal accountability. And I think even in the case of Intel and Bridgewater and Apple, that at times it edged over into that. I can't speak from a lot of close association. I've had some interaction with Apple through the years in terms of coaching and consulting, but I haven't been able to observe it on a ongoing basis. But there's no question that the misuse of accountability can become brutal and excessive. And you often find it where you have executives that have a high propensity for shaming, have a high propensity for perfectionism, and have a high need for personal status and significance in the organization. And when those factors collude, the result can be devastating.
Yeah, so it gets back to what we talked about in previous conversations about kind of the heart or the music of coaching is this sense of care, concern, compassion, this do no harm approach of, I have your best intent. That comes first. So rapport and foundation need to be, that's like the groundwork for accountability, because all of a sudden there's this assumption that, if I'm holding you accountable, it's for your growth and development, not for my, pleasure in finding you, pushing you down.
Without question. This is similar to tracking, as we talked about in the fact-based leadership model, that in both cases of the C, which is commitment, and in the T, in the fact-based approach of tracking progress, both can be badly misused. And so the commitment, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about accountability, but it's more than simply commitment, it's commitment with follow-through. So another reference or book that I like is The Knowing-Doing Gap. And there's one thing to say that you understand and talk the talk. There's another thing about taking action, about actually doing what you've talked about. And at the heart of excellent commitment or excellent accountability is action. It's the doing that really matters. So in both the C and T step in fact-based leadership, you can miss the mark by overshooting mishandling this in a very authoritarian way. No question about it.
And what about, because I see this a lot where I think I'm holding somebody accountable, but we have very different understandings of what was supposed to happen. There wasn't this clarity, in what they had promised to do. I thought they were supposed to do one thing, they thought another, so that when I was, or I guess I've experienced this as well, I feel like I'm performing well, but all of a sudden I'm being held accountable to another standard.
I think all of us have experienced that phenomenon where expectations are unclear. And that's an absolute prescription for disaster when it comes to trying to identify accountability in a way that works for the organization and is empowering to the individual. To achieve that requires a lot of work to make sure that, and a lot of insight to make sure that what you're saying is what the other person is hearing and vice versa. And so in a good accountability conversation, you get this degree of clarity where you ask the other person to paraphrase, what is it that you understand we've agreed to? Here's how I understand. What about the timing of when this will occur? Specifically, what will take place? How will you inform me about this if it's not right? What is my part in helping you with this? How can I get barriers out of your way? Last week we talked about restraining factors and Kurt Lewin's model. Well, the leader, manager, if that is the relationship, or even a friend who's a real friend, can do quite a bit to help remove barriers, even if that's merely by providing encouragement, check-in, support in a timely sort of way, and often with the addition of ideas and perspective that you might lack. So there are many ways that you can help in the accountability process if you're really invested in the whole thing that we talk about every week, growing other people. Growth, this idea of growth of people, well, accountability is fertilizer for growth. And without it, it's not possible. If the soil here is rapport, genuine rapport, that has this idea of strength, but compassion, of caring genuinely for the other person in an authentic way, where the objective is more than my self-interest, boy, that makes a huge difference in terms of the soil that all this grows in. But the fertilizer that makes it bloom, for sure, or perhaps the sunshine, is accountability.
Well, and it sounds like, as we talked about, this clarity of commitment creates an external objective measurement standard, but the subjective internal piece is this desire to see somebody grow, and you need an external measuring stick to see how they're growing. And that's what this, you're holding them accountable to a measuring stick, saying, how's it going? How far are we moving along this thing? And that's as you were talking, that's the image that came to mind. Now, I want to hear a little bit more, because you started talking about organizational culture of accountability, and we always think about holding individuals accountable. What's the cultural aspect of it?
Well, hold that question. I want to go back to the measuring stick, and then let's come to the idea of the culture, because I love what you said about measuring stick. So the measuring stick should not be a beating rod. The measuring stick should, first of all, be created either solely by the person who's going to take action, or jointly with the person who's helping with this accountability and encouragement process. And this is where we go to deliberate practice. And this is Kay Anders Ericsson's work when he talked specifically about the issue of deliberate practice, and a little bit of Albert Bandura, which we can talk about a little later. I wanted to make sure we covered Bandura, and the product of productive accountability is self-efficacy. So let's get to that a little bit later. But Ericsson talks about deliberate practice. Well, this is action. And deliberate practice has to be causal, as opposed to simply correlated. So when we're engaged in a deliberate practice, It's small, it's specific, and it causes the effect that we achieve. That's where measurement is so important in the coaching and development conversation process. So that there are these small, measurable, specific, causal activities that a person can engage in that are absolutely related to the results that you want to get. And so Kay Andrews Erickson talks very eloquently about this and did the seminal research on it. Likewise, Malcolm Gladwell picked it up in Outliers and talks about it, but Erickson is the source of all of this.
Yeah, so this is where the 10,000 hours thing comes in, that a lot of people misinterpret it as just doing it for 10,000 hours is going to get you there, but we know that's not the case.
That's right. Yeah, 10,000 hours of bad practice absolutely derails any sort of growth. It's deliberate practice in the way that Erickson so eloquently defines it. So I highly recommend that. But that idea of measurement is so important to the idea of accountability. And again, done in the right way. This is about the music of accountability as opposed to the mechanics of accountability, because you can get a mechanistic beating rod, as we said, that is a measurement, or you can get this inspiring sense of game playing that comes of achievement that we all enjoyed as kids and can enjoy as adults in terms of making progress and getting better at anything. So very important concept.
Yeah. So last week we talked about the checklist manifesto, and you had made a separate connection with the author of that was Atul Gawande, wasn't it?
Right. Yes.
Well, he also, I sent you a TED Talk that he did where he talks about, it's a TED Talk called, if you want to get great at something, get a coach.
Yeah.
And he brings in this idea that these professionals, these doctors and lawyers and these people, once they enter a profession, like take their development on for themselves and really resist an outside coach. Well, he talks about the need to have that outside accountability and that outside perspective to help you see that you're not as good as you could be.
Yeah.
And I think you're hitting on this of it's not just practice. It's not just hours at the desk or at the table or whatever it is. It's about doing it and reflecting on what you just did. And if you have an outside person helping you process that, that's how you're going to get not just great, but continually get better and better.
So true. You know, I have the privilege of speaking to physicians all the time. I recently talked to 60 of the leading anesthesiologists in the country, and they were engaged with me in a deep conversation about growth. Many of them said it was the first time they'd done that, any sort of development of that nature in their careers, which is startling. Wonderful people. But the problem is that we've told them that they are brilliant, that they're the smartest people in the room. And many people think, I guess I've reached the pinnacle and I don't need anything more. And boy, what a mistake. All of us, you, I, everyone listening, needs to continually think about how they grow, achieve, and get better. And that requires feedback, accountability for what they're doing, and continuous commitment to making change. You know, in the Catholic Church, there was a tradition started by Saint Ignatius of Loyola called the practice of examine. And the notion of examine is thinking about the day and thinking about, based on your definition of success, and this in a spiritual sense, of where it is that you want to go, how'd you do today in terms of the kind of commitment you've made. I think that's such a healthy practice for all of us, regardless of your persuasion or perspective or religion or lack of it or whatever. The concept is so powerful that we are humble enough to consider, here's what I said, here's how I talked about who I want to be and the kind of person I'd like to be. How do I actually do at that today. I genuinely try to do that every day. I don't always. I'd be lying if I said one of my aspirations is to be a person of great integrity. And so the fact is, I don't do it every day. And when I do, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, it sounds like, because I listen to different podcasts about creativity and performance, and over, I'm hearing more and more high performers talking about starting the day with meditation or setting intentions or whatever format it is. But basically, it's before they allow outside sources to set their agenda. They define what they want to accomplish in that day, in that week. They define success first. And in a lot of ways, it's setting that internal accountability. And for me personally, I try and do it. I've got my little journal here. I use it for a lot of things, but a lot of the time it's just, hey, what's working, or what do I want to accomplish? And again, I like to say I do it every morning, but no, I try. But the idea of having this accountability, if I just hold it in my head, I tend to edit as I go, and as I fail, I can easily shift it in my head to, no, that wasn't really a failure. I didn't really fall short. But if I write it down, all of a sudden I have this objective evidence of what I intended. Now, the next step is when I have a coach, a thought partner that I share it with, and all of a sudden there's somebody, not just my journal or my own brain, but somebody outside of me is coming back and saying, how did it go? How did it do? And when they're a trusted thought partner, it's not threatening, it's supportive.
Absolutely. So here's my little journal. Right in the opening of the journal is a way of keeping score, of measuring, of being accountable about this. And so it has two sides. And each day, sometime in the afternoon, I go through looking at how did I do on what I said I would do. And I find it a powerful way. Now, in a coaching situation, I often have clients create the scorecard just like that and send it to me in an interactive way. So a fillable PDF that you and I have worked on together, and that I'm starting to use. In the past, I had them take a picture of this and then send it to me in that form. And I think the more, again, going to last week's conversation, the more we can take impediments out of the way and make it easier for people to have accountability to the others, the better it works.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that you want to make sure that we get to this, the idea of how accountability impacts efficacy. So can you tell me a little bit about what efficacy is, and then how it's related to accountability?
Sure. In the late 80s, or actually the early 80s, Albert Bandura at Stanford University was the champion of this idea in both research and practice of self-efficacy. And Bandura's idea was that there was a huge movement in the late 60s in California for self-esteem, the so-called self-esteem movement. There were a number of books written about self-esteem, and a lot of parents and managers were told, boy, the way to really help employees or your children is to build their self-efficacy, and that really backfired. So what we got was a sense of entitlement and the idea that I am the center of the universe, a certain degree of narcissism in a whole population of people who were told, you are beautiful, you are amazing, you are wonderful, you are brilliant, which all sounds positive, but had a really negative backlash.
It seems like there's a connection between that and the growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, where if you're told over and over again that self-worth, you are valuable who you are, it creates this static perspective, as opposed to, you know what, you're valuable, but you can continue to grow and get better.
Well, you're exactly right. And who speaks about this really brilliantly is Carol Dweck in Mindset. And what Carol talks about is the fact that we've ruined a lot of students by helping them get a fixed mindset of either you're smart or you aren't. And this goes back to her campaign to stop the misuse of IQ tests in educational settings, where people either live down to or live up to the idea of I'm either brilliant or stupid. But even if when students are given the idea that they are brilliant, when they find contrary evidence that they don't pass a test or get into Harvard or blah, 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 achieve what they think they should, that a brilliant person would, they fold, they collapse in that situation. So this is about hardiness. This is about the whole issue of resilience, of emotional and mental resilience. And her emphasis on the fact that hard work and failure are a friend of a person with a growth mindset. So very, very important to not muse it. But back to Bandura and the idea of self-efficacy. The way he defines it is a very precise and accurate understanding of the relationship between your efforts and the results that they are likely to produce. That's a really important, every word in that definition is important. I didn't find that specific definition from Bandura, but that's how I put all of his writing together. That is that what many people talk about when they talk about self-efficacy is confidence. And my proposition is that confidence is the result of self-efficacy, not the issue of self-efficacy. So people who have in my humble opinion, a more shallow understanding of self-efficacy think it's just building people's self-confidence, thinking you can do it, and so forth. I think that, again, back to Carol Dweck, builds false self-efficacy or false confidence, because at the first sign of failure or setback or whatever, this so-called you can do it, pump up motivation just completely ends up being derailed. But it is an accurate and precise understanding of the relationship of going back to the idea of K. Anders Ericsson, going back to this concept of a precise understanding of the causal behaviors and the results that they are most likely to produce, but not always produce. And then the grit, as Kelly McGonigal would talk about, to go through setback and difficulty that help people to grow over time.
Yeah, I'd heard, I think you might have talked about it this way, but self-efficacy as being an evidence-based belief in your competency to perform in a new situation. Yes. So being able to transfer the successes that you've had, the competencies that you've applied in one area, to be able to translate that into a new and novel setting.
Absolutely. And I love your phrase, based. You know, just like we talk about fact-based. So when self-confidence is the product of evidence-based experience, when I do this, this occurs. Not every time, but almost every time. And the more precise and accurate the understanding, the insight of that relationship, if you give a child that, or an employee, or a friend, or a spouse, or yourself, an insight into that sort of relationship in many different aspects. It could be physical aspects of behavior, or it could be about mental tasks, or emotional, in the emotional level. When you listen thoughtfully to me and don't interrupt me, but hear me out, and then sort of paraphrase back to me what you think I've said, and we clarify that, that makes such a difference in the quality of our conversation. Helping people with those insights, which good coaches do, huge in terms of their growth. And people deeply appreciate helping see those connections between the things they do and what they really want. Almost everyone wants great relationships with others, but they often don't have the insights about what they do that causes those relationships to cave badly or to flourish in the positive sense.
So that's the connection, at least as you make it there, the connection between self-efficacy and accountability is that you need to have that ruler, not the beating stick, in order to get that evidence-based progress, that you are actually getting better and better and better as measured by your intentions.
That, clearly, yes. And without it, you risk people not understanding the relationships, really being confused and sometimes very demotivated, positively or negatively. You know, when you say, great game to a child walking off of the field, that's terrible feedback because they think, great game. Let's see, when I tripped that other player and the ref didn't see it and I stepped out of bounds and they missed that, and was that great game? Or was it when I hogged the ball and actually scored that time, but all my teammates were completely depressed because I didn't use them at all in that process? Is that great game? So great game, terrible feedback, but good feedback on a measurement basis is, I know you've been working on opening up the lane by drawing the ball to the forward so that the pressure goes to the left side of the court, opening up that right side pass for the cut through the lane. And that's really working for you. I saw 3 incidences of that. I've got it on video. Let me show you how that worked, because the pick and roll, when you open it that way, works beautifully. That kind of coaching from a coach is amazing.
Well, I think about, for me, when I get feedback, hey, John, good job, I never buy it. I always think that, oh, they're just blowing smoke, unless they give me the specifics about what is it that they did. Same thing goes. The problem is I believe too much when they say, you know, John, that was horrible. That I'll buy. Yeah. And I think it's the opposite for some people, where if they hear good job, they immediately own it like they deserve it. And if they hear bad job, they immediately discount it. And I think you can't, when you give specific feedback, like, and in this case, in the tracking where you've made this clear commitment and then you're going back and revisiting that commitment, it's where learning happens, when you're comparing it to a standard.
Well, right. And this goes back to one of my heroes, as you know, Daniel Kahneman. And Kahneman talks about the fact that the negatives, whether through personal self-narrative or from another, have valence 5 or 6 times as powerful as positive feedback. We are very attentive to that. And this comes from a survival instinct. We are wired to sort for the negative because it represents threat, could mean the loss of life for us. And so we are hugely attentive to negative information as opposed to positive information about what's going on in our environment. Everyone fears losing their job, being demoted in a job, receiving harsh criticism in front of others. And as a consequence, you often get very safekeeping behavior as opposed to appropriate risk-taking. And I use the word appropriate consciously, because I'm not talking about crazy risk-taking, right, but prudent risk-taking.
Well, and I think you bring something up that's near and dear to my heart, which is some of the brain science around that the amygdala and the limbic system is designed for life on the savannah, where we had to have our head on a swivel, always looking for the threat, and fight or flight or faint was the first response. Not so helpful in our world today, where we have this big, highly developed prefrontal cortex where executive function lives, where when we see a threat and we immediately, in Goldman's terms, get hijacked, we lose access to our best thinking. Exactly. And the idea, and I think what Kahneman gets at is the slow thinking is that prefrontal cortex, that judgment, the hard stuff that our brains are wired for if we're intentional about it.
Yeah, boy, so true. I often say to groups and people that I'm coaching, we think that we are rational human beings that have occasional emotions, but that's not what the science shows. That's not what the research or data prove. The data prove that we are emotional beings that have occasional rational thoughts. And so we are easily hijacked by the amygdala. We're easily run off, and fear is the basis of almost virtually all aberrant behavior. So
And
we
it
operate.
gets, it gets to where if accountability is associated with fear, then we stop getting access to our best thinking. But if accountability is associated with our own development and growth, then all of a sudden this accountability can actually help us become present to use our best thinking to move forward.
Exactly right. Yeah, and I think this goes back to your question about culture and really healthy cultures and really productive cultures. Healthy, productive cultures are characterized by accountability, where there's a sense of meaning and and purpose and dignity, and that by pursuing my own goals, when they are in alignment with something larger, and when I am respected as an individual and empowered, the consequence is highly productive organizations where people are absolute advocates, healthy cultures, not cultish, but healthy cultures where people are proud of the work they do, want others to come join it, are proud to talk about it, high degrees of engagement in those cultures, and great results. And when you're able to produce that sort of a healthy culture, it lifts all boats. Everyone who operates in such a culture, because we are so influenced by the culture. You know my adage, not unique to me, many people have said it, and I'm simply joining the chorus, that you put a good person in a bad culture, the culture will win almost every time. But you put any of us in a really great culture and it ups our game. And so when you have a wholesome environment of accountability in a culture that comes from helping people understand in a compassionate way the relationship between their actions and the results they get, both good and bad. And when it's the bad, conveying that in a way that demonstrates your real concern for the person, your care for them, your valuing of them, it makes a huge difference. You know, William James, as I've said before, says that we are driven, that he was a drive theorist, that human beings are driven, and the overriding drive of all human beings is the drive to feel valued and understood and appreciated and cared for and treated with respect and dignity. And we will do almost anything for that. We will even do heinous acts, get 15 minutes of fame, thinking that we are important, we matter. Especially you see this in aberrant behavior, again, of people who've come from difficult backgrounds where they didn't get that sense. They didn't get healthy self-efficacy. And as a consequence, they have low self-esteem. And they thirst, as we all do, to feel cared for, valued, appreciated, and so forth. And they'll do virtually anything, including terrible acts, to get it.
Yeah, and that's where they when it was about attention, that's how they got value through attention, even if negative attention. So they would be reinforced by the negative behavior because they got attention by it. Now, I think Viktor Frankl takes it a little bit differently than James and talks about not just the value, but meaning, that when you find meaning in your life, that intrinsic part of it, where I am living a meaningful life, that's where he found the power in his work, in his logotherapy stuff.
Oh, so right. If you can bring up Viktor Frankl's great book, The Man's Search for Meaning, this is one of the most powerful books in my experience. and Frankel's experience in concentration camps in World War II as a prisoner and then as a doctor, a genuinely good doctor, as a psychiatrist, trying to help other prisoners, observed that when people have this powerful sense of meaning and value in life, they flourish even in the most difficult circumstances. If we as human beings, especially we as coaches and teachers and people in the talent development arena, human resource specialists and leaders really care about the development of others, we start with a deep understanding and helping others to gain a deeper understanding of their sense of purpose, meaning, and value for pursuing all of life.
So we're running out of time here, Fred, but I wanted to make sure you got the last word about the power and importance of accountability in helping people grow. How would you summarize your thoughts on it?
Yes, I would say that coaching without accountability is fruitless. That and a desire for development without accountability and support falls apart. So I love that Atul Gawande has said, if you want to grow, and you should want to grow, get a coach. The idea of having someone who can help you in the right sort of compassionate and strong way, be accountable to doing what you need to do by putting together Bandura's idea of a precise and accurate understanding of your actions and their relationship to the desired results that you produce. When you add that to coaching, it is fertilizer for growth. It is sunlight. And people flourish when that happens. And when it's lacking, you're wasting time.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Fred. And so many good things for us to talk about next time, from judgment to the role of trust, even positive conflict and how that works into all this. But thanks a lot for being here, Fred. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Always love talking to you, John. See ya.
See you later. Thanks a lot, Fred. And I hope that you guys enjoyed this episode of Growing People, a conversation with Fred Harburg. More to come. Please subscribe to the podcast, comments, questions, look for the upcoming announcement of when our next conversation is going to be, and have a great day.